Good evening and welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Nadia Massi and we're live from Paris. Here are the headlines at 10 p.m. The French president arrived in Washington for an official state visit, the first by a world leader since Donald Trump took office. A highly symbolic trip, but Syria, Iran and trade all likely to top the agenda. The only surviving suspect of the Paris 2015 attacks is sentenced to 20 years by a Belgian court. Salah Abdel Salam convicted of attempted murder following the shootout with police in Brussels, months after the November rampage that killed 130 people. And Saudi-led coalition airstrikes kill a top Houthi official in Yemen, a major blow to the rebel movement there. This as 20 die when a bomb hits a wedding party in the north of the country. Let's begin for you then with some developing news just coming into us from Toronto. The city's Sunnybrook Hospital says it's received 7 patients after a man in a white rental van drove into a crowd of pedestrians in the centre of the city. The driver fled the scene but was later arrested by police. It's not yet clear whether or not the incident was a deliberate act, and we will bring you more on that story here on France 24 as soon as we have it. Let's go then to our main story this evening. Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Washington for the first state visit by a foreign leader since Donald Trump came to power. The symbolic visit comes just 9 months after Paris rolled out the red carpet for the US leader here. Trade, Syria and Iran all likely to dominate proceedings, with the French leader under pressure to keep the United States in the Iranian nuclear accord ahead of a make-or-break deadline next month. The Elysee Palace, though, has described this trip as more about cementing what they say is an already warm friendship between the two leaders rather than just talking politics. And tonight, Macron and his wife Brigitte will sit down for a private dinner with the Trumps at Mount Vernon. Well, a little earlier on, when Macron touched down, he spoke to our correspondent in Washington. Here's what he had to say then.
We'll have extremely frank, direct discussions about our bilateral relationship, as well as our common interests, such as security, business and the environment. We already speak to each other a lot. We have regular conversations. Quite recently, we've taken military action together. But I think this state visit, the first of Trump's presidency, is an important one. Firstly, to mark the strength of our bilateral relationship, but also in order to set out a common agenda. Well, to discuss then some of the challenges that Macron faces on this trip, we can talk now to Eric Brattenberg, a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace based in Washington. Thanks very much for coming on the programme this evening. Let me ask you, first of all, the Iranian nuclear deal certainly key on this trip as it comes up for renewal in May. Trump, we know, been very critical of that deal in the past, but Emmanuel Macron, who wants to keep the United States certainly in that accord, he's someone who really believes in the diplomatic power of persuasion. Can he persuade Trump to stay in the deal?
Well, it's going to be a very tall order. Donald Trump has already signaled that he is likely to pull out of the deal and reimpose U.S. sanctions on May 12. And I think having John Bolton as his national security advisor and likely to get Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State if he's confirmed by the Senate, that makes it even more likely that the U.S. will pull out of the deal. So I think it's going to be a very tall order for Macron to try to convince the president to stay in the deal. Macron has done a lot to try to get Europe to take a tougher stand on Iran, but whether that's enough to convince the president remains to be seen, and whether Macron can translate his personal relationship with President Trump to actually try to get a concession on him on Iran will be very, very difficult.
Stakes high for Macron, though, in other areas too, least of all Syria. Macron, after those strikes that we saw last week, saying that he managed to persuade the United States to remain keeping its troops inside Syria. That was then rebuffed by the United States. So clearly the behind the scenes is not quite as straightforward as it sometimes appears publicly. What is Macron hoping to achieve when it comes to Syria?
Well, for Macron and for France, Syria is a key priority. France still continues to struggle with terrorism and ISIS. It's concerned about the instability in the Middle East and the potential for more refugees coming to Europe. So this is a big priority for France. And what he really hopes to get out of President Trump is a commitment to have the US remain involved in Syria, to play a leading role and to try to support a political transition. And it comes on top of some of the comments that Trump made recently about speculating about a U.S. withdrawal from Syria. And that has France and Macron very concerned. So I think what Macron will push for, and why I think in part the strikes that France participated and play a leading role in, is really designed to demonstrate to the U.S. that France can play a leading role and to try to support a process in the region that would get more European support and supports from the Gulf allies, but also trying to keep the U.S. involved. So that will be his ask from Trump. And again, it's going to be very difficult to see Trump committing to a broader agenda in the Middle East and keeping U.S. troops there, something which he has been very critical of.
Let's talk just briefly then about the personal relationship between these two. Macron is sometimes referred to as the Trump whisperer for his apparent close relations with the US president. And the Elysée saying this isn't really about politics, but just about building those ties between the pair. Is that fair? Do we have any sense of how well they get on?
It is fair that the two have developed a unique relationship. President Macron is probably closer to Trump than any other European leaders, despite disagreements on a lot of the substantive issues. And I think in large part this has to do with Macron's ability to charm President Trump. The visit to Paris last year was very successful. I think he is perceived by Donald Trump as a winner, as someone who is charismatic and wants to make his country great again. And I think also there's an aspect here that Trump has been very critical on Germany and has struggled to develop a relationship with Angela Merkel. And this is something that Macron has been able to capitalize on and try to position himself as the critical player between the United States and Europe. But again, the real question is, and I think it's something that Macron will increasingly face domestically in France and in Europe, if he fails to deliver some type of concession on Trump on the key issues at hand, whether Iran, Syria, or trade, how long will this relationship be sustainable? And what's really in it for France if they can't seem to get Trump to change his view on any of these issues?
Okay, many more questions still to come then. Eric Brattenberg talking to us there from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace based in Washington. In other world news then, the only surviving suspect of the 2015 Paris terror attacks has been found guilty of attempted murder by a Belgian court. Judges described Salah Abdeslam as dangerous and committed to radicalism as they handed down the maximum sentence of 20 years. Abdeslam is being held in a jail here in France pending a separate trial over the Paris attacks where 130 people were killed. France 24's Selena Sykes brings us this report.
Capture of the most wanted man in Europe. Salah Abdeslam, the sole surviving suspect from the 2015 Paris attacks, has been found guilty of attempted murder, which a Belgian court said was clearly linked to terrorism. The 15th of March 2016, the 28-year-old who had been on the run for 4 months was holed up in this flat south of Brussels. Abdeslam and 2 other men fired on police as they raided the building. Several officers were wounded before shooting dead one of the gunmen. Abdeslam and the other man, Sofiane Harari, fled. 3 days later, they were arrested near Abdeslam's family home in Molenbeek. Just days after his capture, a terrorist cell thought to be linked to the Paris attacks carried out twin bombings in Brussels. An attack investigators say took place earlier than planned, after Abdeslam was apprehended. A Belgian court has handed Abdeslam the maximum 20-year sentence demanded by prosecutors, saying there can be no doubt over his involvement in extremism.
Following the verdict and sentence, I will consult with Salah Abdeslam on whether or not he wishes to appeal.
Belgian-born Abdeslam was not in court as the verdict was read out and has refused to cooperate or attend the trial since its opening day. He remains in a high-security prison south of Paris as he awaits trial in France for his alleged role in the November 13th Paris attacks that left 130 people dead and hundreds wounded.
Well, as you heard there in that report, Abdeslam's conviction today is not for his role in the 2015 attacks here in Paris, but for a shootout with police several months later in Belgium. France 24's Alison Sargent then reminds us of the events that led to his arrest.
It was the shootout that led to the capture of the most wanted man in Europe. French and Belgian police were met with gunfire when they raided this apartment south of Brussels. Holed up inside, 3 men, including Salah Abdeslam, the only living suspect in the November 2015 Paris terror attacks.
Several officers were wounded before shooting dead one of the gunmen. Abdeslam and the other man fled. 3 days later, they were arrested near Abdeslam's family home in Molenbeek, bringing the 4-month-long manhunt to an end. Just days after his capture, a terrorist cell thought to be linked to the Paris attacks carried out twin bombings in Brussels. An attack investigators say took place earlier than planned after Abdeslam was apprehended. The Belgian-born Abdeslam was being tried for terrorist-related attempted murder and possession of arms, along with the other surviving suspect in the shootout, Tunisian national Sofiane Ayari. Neither appeared in court to hear the verdict. Abdeslam has refused to return to the trial in Belgium since its opening day, when he accused the court of anti-Muslim bias and stated that he only put trust in Allah. Abdeslam remains in a high-security prison south of Paris as he awaits trial in France for his alleged role in the November 13th attacks that left 130 people dead and hundreds of others wounded. A date hasn't been set, but the trial is not expected to begin before the year 2020.
A senior Houthi leader in Yemen has been killed by a Saudi coalition airstrike. It was confirmed this Monday, dealing a major blow to rebels there. Salah al-Ahmad was killed on Thursday in Hodeidah province, the most important Houthi official to be killed by the coalition since the bombing began in Yemen in 2015 to try and push Houthis back from an insurgency towards the capital. Samad was the second on the coalition's list of most wanted Houthi leaders after the group's leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi. Saudi Arabia had offered a $20 million reward for any information that led to Samad's capture. Well, in the course of the 3-year war in Yemen, coalition officials have insisted that they don't target civilians. Thousands, though, have been killed by airstrikes, including on schools and hospitals. And on Sunday, an air raid hit a wedding party in the north of Yemen and killed at least 20 people. France 24's Haxi Meyers-Belkin has the story.
A wedding party that ended in bloodshed. When a double airstrike hit nighttime celebrations in the northern Yemeni province of Hajjah, this hospital received the majority of the victims. Dozens of other wedding guests were killed on impact, among them the bride. Her new husband survived.
We don't have any weapons. They were targeting civilians without any reason.
Health authorities have urged locals to donate blood in the aftermath of the strikes. Many survivors were brought in with life-threatening injuries, among them women and children.
We received 47 cases, most of them in a critical condition after a bombing by Saudi air forces on a wedding in the city of Bani Qais. We were able to help most of them. Those we couldn't treat here were transferred to Sana'a.
This is the latest deadly airstrike in Yemen in recent days. Earlier missiles hit a home and a packed bus. Yemen's Iran-backed Shiite Houthi rebels, who control much of the north and the capital Sana'a, blame the Saudi-led coalition that supports the country's government. Since fighting started 3 years ago, some 10,000 civilians have been killed. Rights groups and UN officials lay blame for most of those deaths at the feet of the anti-Houthi Arab coalition.
South Korea has ended propaganda it's been broadcasting across the border with the north since 2016 as a show of good faith ahead of key meetings this week. Seoul had been blasting anti-Pyongyang messages and K-pop songs from loudspeakers on the border since the North's 4th nuclear test in early 2016. Kim Jong-un's regime has been responding with its own broadcasts and balloons carrying anti-South Korean leaflets across the frontier. The move, though, comes amid a positive thaw with amid recent development with the North Korean leadership and the US president also slated to meet in the coming months. Let's head now to Nicaragua then, where deadly protests have killed dozens of people in recent days. The United States has ordered its embassy staff out of the country, and the president there, Daniel Ortega, has announced he's scrapping the controversial pension reforms that sparked the initial demonstrations. But as Ivana Scotola reports, some Nicaraguans believe he still needs to step down.
Armed vigilantes have taken to the streets of the Nicaraguan capital to protect shops and local people from looters. who are taking advantage of 5 days of violent protests and instability across the country.
We're protecting our possessions, everything that we've worked hard for. I don't want anyone to target us, but we're ready for anything.
On Sunday, President Daniel Ortega backed down on a controversial social reform that sparked the demonstrations in a bid to restore calm and normality.
What we have done is revoke or cancel the resolution which acted as a trigger that started this whole situation.
But some protesters say it's not enough. Dozens were killed and many more injured as authorities cracked down on public anger, with the military taking control of the streets. People were initially frustrated at the proposed reform to cut pensions and social benefits by 5% while increasing taxes. But anger spilled over into general dissatisfaction with the government, including recent increases in the cost of fuel and electricity. And now they want answers.
And what about the people who died? Are they going to bring them back? No.
Some are saying they won't back down until Ortega and his wife resign. The president has come under international scrutiny as violence spiralled, and several Nicaraguan news channels were taken off air for covering the protests. This is the biggest challenge that Ortega has had to face in his 11 years in power. And the question is now whether he'll be able to restore the public's faith in his leadership.